welcome everyone. This is the last organised planned session, but I have had a request that next week we look at launching and recovering from the slipway at Erith. As a few people, how can I put this, discovered it's not quite as easy as it looks, especially when the wind is behind you, and there's and stopping doesn't involve throwing an anchor out the back and hoping for the best. So we'll look at that next week, and I shall draw some really elegantly designed diagrams so that people can remember, and it will help you when it comes to sailing with or without a safety boat. So this evening we're going to look at the standard operating procedure for independent sailing, and by independent sailing I really mean this is where you're sailing without a safety boat cover, and either you're sailing on your own or you're sailing in company with other people. So I will stress right from the start that when you're sailing in company with other people, you are literally sailing in company. If they're the slowest boat in the fleet, you sail with them. Yeah, you always keep them in sight. We have had in the past instances of boats going off sailing in company, and the next thing I've known, I'm on the end of a telephone from the Port of London Authority telling me that the Iron Alive, their launch and a helicopter are all now dealing with a capsize recovery in the middle of the river up near Woolwich, and then discover that of the 3 boats that were there, one of them had gone ahead round the corner and no one knew. So so that's why when you sail in company, you sail in company, however irritating it might be that you've got someone who's slower than you. What it does is it just means you have to sail away and then back again like a sheepdog, and then you get extra miles in. You see it as that rather than the person's going too slow. So the other thing that I want you all to do is I'm going to pose questions over this, and then I will show you the standard operating procedure that we have. So everything that we're going to cover today, we have pretty much covered through all the sessions. So this really acts like an aid memoir for you to remember what you have or haven't learned or remember, because everything we've taught you in terms of the theory is applied to what you would do before you go sailing without a safety boat, or even with a safety boat, so if you're, but especially without a safety boat. So I wrote the standard operating procedures years ago because of that incident that I mentioned, because I was Commodore at the time, and what I didn't want to happen was to be standing up in court and explaining why we didn't have guidelines for club members and that I was personally liable. So I wrote these as my get out of jail card, literally and metaphorically, and I have had to update them recently because of the Port of London Authority conversations I've had, but I will PDF them and send them round to you all, and John and I can work out putting them on the website as well, just so that people have them to refer to. So let's use this weekend as an example. Let's say we're all going to go for a sail. What do you think you would need to consider when it comes to going sailing this weekend? You think about the first sessions that we did, so feel free to unmute yourself and answer.
Weather.
Okay. Yep. So what particular would you be looking for, Luke, in the weather?
Wind speed and direction.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else about the weather? So we've thought about the wind.
Whether it's raining or any fog or any other adverse conditions.
Excellent.
Just a sec for a minute, please.
Yeah. So so if you've got the wind, and then the weather itself, whether it's sunny. So why would we be interested in whether it's raining or foggy or sunny?
Visibility.
Yep.
And the strength of the wind, squalls.
So what else would we think about? So it's not just looking at those, it's other bits. So if it's raining, what would you want to be wearing, for example? You know, do you think wearing a shorty wetsuit when it's 6 degrees with a 4-degree wind
No,
chill factor?
appropriate clothing for this, for the weather, whether it's hot, cold, or wet or
Excellent.
sunny.
Yeah. So do you remember this?
I'll turn off.
This is what almost six. This is 6 weeks ago. Well, we discussed this. It seems a long time ago now. So yes, in terms of wind, direction and speed. Yes, in terms of what the weather itself is like, whether it's sunny, raining, etc., because that will inform the clothing that you wear. In addition to wearing a buoyancy aid and gloves, what kind of hat you might wear. You know, a few weekends ago over Easter, John and I went sailing, and on the Saturday we were fully togged up because it was really, really chilly. And then on the Sunday I was in a shorty wetsuit because it went from being wind chill factor of what, 4 degrees to being 20 degrees Celsius. It was incredible. Yeah, always be dressed appropriately, but also take things with you in a dry bag that you may need, like a jumper or a spray top if you're not wearing one. So you always take additional clothing with you, especially if you capsize and you then have to get back in the boat. Putting something dry on, even though it will get wet, putting something dry on initially will help you warm up. So always take something else with you. What else do we need to consider? We discussed it last week.
Tide.
Yeah, tides, well done. So what do we need to think about with the tide? Let's say we're going to, I don't know, Greenhithe, which is down towards Dartford. What would we need to think about with the tide? Yep. So we ideally, what direction do we want the tide to be going in for us to go to the pub? Out. Excellent. Yes. So we want to use the tide as a conveyor belt. And as we want to go in the same direction as the tide, we would make sure that the tide is appropriate for that trip to Greenhithe. So this weekend, low water is about 11 o'clock. So if you wanted to go to the pub at Greenhithe, you know that you're going to have to leave at least 2 hours before to get there before low water. The trouble with getting to the pub too early is that you'll be very drunk when the tide has turned and it's time to come back up to the yacht club. You might need assistance from the RNLI to get on the slipway. So, so yes, to the tide. So we're doing pretty well. The other thing to also be aware of is the sea state. So if you know that the wind is easterly, and sorry, let's say westerly, the wind is westerly and is blowing from the west to the east, and the tide is coming in, you've got wind against tide, and what that will do is that will make the waves quite big. So you need to consider the safety of that for the type of boat you're in. So if you're in a sit-down boat, that's perfect, because actually you'll be okay. But if you're on a trapeze boat where the stability of that boat is about its speed and its flatness, you might want to consider changing your boat or your plans. So it's about being aware of the condition of the water as well as whatever the weather itself is going to do. Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah. So last Sunday, was it last Sunday? No, the Easter Sunday, when John and I were down there, it started off with absolutely no wind. So we hung around doing useful things like land drills and anti-fouling a yacht. And then eventually the wind picked up and we went out for sail. So we tailored our sail, our independent sail without a safety boat, to what the conditions were doing. And as soon as we knew that wind was strong enough that we could sail against the tide on, we knew that we now could actually go sailing, and we would just buddy up out on the water to make sure we were all safe and sound. So that was a practical example of that last 2 weeks ago. The other thing I will also mention is that the last time you make a decision about whether you go sailing is at the bottom of that slipway before you launch. Yeah, so you're looking, because is the moment when you can see exactly what the conditions are like in terms of the wind, the weather, the tide, the sea conditions. And that will be the last time when you'll look at those and go, yes, it's safe to go, or actually, do you know what, I think I will just chicken out on this. I've done that last year. My crew and I went down the bottom of the slipway. We looked at each other, turned the boat around and went back up the slipway, while other people went sailing because we were too light. You know, our combined body weight was 18 stone, but actually the wind was so strong, you needed to be about 25 stone in the boat for it to be a safe sail, and there was no way we could do that, even though we had already put a reef in and made the sail area smaller. So we've done the passage planning bit and the sail conditions. So let's also have a think about the boat now. So what's the first thing we're going to do? We've taken the cover off the boat and we're looking at it. What would you normally want to do before you go on a long journey? And you do this with your car or the equivalent with your car.
Go to the toilet.
You joke, but that's probably normally the third last thing you do after checking the bung and launching. Sorry, before checking the bung for the last time and launching. Especially in a dry suit, you always need to make sure you come to the toilet, otherwise you're a bit hamstrung. So you've taken the cover off the boat. What are you going to do?
You have a sort of check around, check the strads are nice and tight, check everything sort of, the wires are tight and things like that.
Yes, so I tend to start, when I rig the boat, I sort of mentally check everything. So I always rig, because I have a two sail boat. I check the jib and the forestay when I'm doing that the cleats work properly, that there's no obvious wear on the ropes or on the shroud on the wires holding the mast up. And it's worth just checking all these things. At the back of the boat, you've got a pin and a sort of a hole called a pintle and gudgeon, which holds the rudder on. They can work loose, which reminds me, Eve, you'll need to do something to the Miracle because they do work loose, the pintle and gudgeon on the Miracle.
Sorry, I had a phone call then. I'm not sorry.
Right.
What did you say? Works loose?
So on the Miracle, you'll just need to check the pintle and gudgeon that hold the rudder on because they do work loose. I never got round to resealing those.
It needs repacking or something. Yeah,
basically, yeah.
I've already looked at. You showed it to me. It's a bit loose.
You see, I tighten it up and then forget. So I just, while I remembered, I thought I'd mention it. So yeah, so with the boat, it's worth checking. Is it seaworthy? Have you got any cracks in it? Is the bung in correctly? It's always worth checking the bung. So on a bosun dinghy, which are the big old white ones right outside the clubhouse, they have a bung in the floor that is hidden by the tow strap for the helm. Yeah, so it's really easy to forget to check that, and the first time you'll know you've got it wrong is when you launch it and all the water comes pouring into the boat really quickly. So it's always worth checking everything to make sure that there are bungs in and that they're fitted properly, because you get different types of bung and some people like to jam them in. So we've looked at the boat itself. What else do you think you might want to take with you on your boat, as let's say you have to drop your sails, so you can't use them?
A paddle.
Yep. So if you've got space, you can take a paddle, or in the case of John and Eve, you can take a praddle, which is like a single-hander paddle. So John, being in a laser on his own, he can't really have an oar, which is about 4 foot, 5 foot long, because he doesn't really have space for it. But a praddle is 2 foot long, and it can be put, on the side of the boat or stuck into the buoyancy tank, so it can be retrieved.
Yeah, in practice on mine, I would get to the front of the boat and paddle with my arms.
You paddle it like a surfboard.
Yeah.
And if you're in a star, you want to take a baler as well.
We're getting onto that. And
an anchor.
So what we're looking at basically is alternative means of propulsion. That's what you should always look at having on the boat. So on the Laser 2000 I've got, I have a Prattle. Well, I would do, except I've mislaid it. I can't remember what I've done with it. So that Prattle means that if it was too windy for me to sail and I needed to get back, I could still paddle. Or let's say my sail had torn and I couldn't use it, I can still paddle the boat back. I have rowed a Hamble Star, which is one of the wooden boats. I've rowed it from Lower Hope Reach, which is down past Gravesend, back to the yacht club, and it took me about 3 hours of rowing because there was no wind. So, whereas Eve, who was there on the same day, was in an Orkney foreen, which is designed for long distance rowing. It's shaped for long distance rowing, and they just disappeared off. See, there was no sailing in company on that day. But so alternative means
We were rowing in company.
yeah, indeed. If you're an optimist, and as a kid, I was taught you have a pole that holds the sail up called a sprit. So you take the sprit off and then you go to the front of the boat and you'd use that like a pair of paddles. And that was our alternative means of propulsion. The other thing to do is to take spare ropes and shackles with you. And I don't mean, sort of 2-inch diameter towing ropes that you'd find on a barge. I mean sort of useful bits of rope that you might need on your dinghy. And shackles, you never know when a shackle is mysteriously going to untighten itself and the pin fall out over the side. It does happen. So it's worth having a few spares just in case.
Cable ties are good too.
Sorry?
Cable ties are good too.
Yes, cable ties, that they have their uses as well.
Could you just remind me, sorry to interrupt you,
yeah.
Joe, the shackles, just remind me, what are those? I mean, I know what a shackle is, but on the boat, what would it be doing? So
a shackle can be used for attaching sails to the boom, attaching shrouds to the boat. What else can it be used for? I have one where a pulley block broke, but actually I found it's more efficient just to have a shackle there for the rope to slide along rather than a pulley block. So they're useful to have, and also the bits of string to have are you can get things like 2 mil, 3 mil, 4 mil diameter rope depending on what you need it for. But I've raced a dinghy with Ed where on the start line the rope on my trapeze wire snapped as the start gun went, and luckily I had a pocket full of random bits of rope. So as I was out on the trapeze wire still attached, I was able to repair the rope so that we could carry on racing for the next hour and a half. So it's always worth having, and sometimes if you've got a random piece of rope like I seem to have always lying around in my living room, if you needed to be towed but you didn't have a long enough painter attached to the front of your boat, you can then just use the rope and tie it on so you can actually get towed by someone else.
Thank you.
So the other thing, talking about towing, is if your dinghy that you've got doesn't have a rope attached to the bow, to the front of it, it's well worth investing in getting one. Not only does that help you tie your boat to the slipway when you need to take your trolley up and down, but if you get into trouble, a boat can come alongside and immediately pick up your your painter, and it becomes a tow line. Now, the sailing club I used to be a member of up in North Wales, you had to have a 5-meter long painter because it meant that they could literally just come alongside, grab it, tie you off and go without having the faff of throwing you a rope. You then have to do something with it. That was how they operated. So on the Miracle, it's got quite a long painter, and on my boat, the 2000, it's got a fairly long painter. I think it's about 4 meters on the 2000s. So always make sure that if you're going on especially on a longish trip, that you have a painter, or the rope at the front of the boat is quite long, just in case you need it. If your boat is designed for it, I would also suggest taking an anchor. You can get small grapnel anchors that are a few kilos. They're quite useful. If you were getting into trouble, you can sail close inshore, chuck the anchor out, tying it around the mast or the seat in the middle of the boat called a thwart. And what that does is that allows you to take a deep breath, because your boat now is not going anywhere. Your boat will be bobbing up and down. You can work out what you need to do if you're in any trouble. So if your boat's designed for it, and a lot of modern boats aren't really designed for carrying anchors, but it is a useful item to have if you can. Again, the club I was at, it was their bylaw that your boat had to have an anchor. So you had to be quite imaginative with how you stored an anchor. That meant if you capsized, it didn't unravel itself and then anchor you upside down to the bottom of the seabed, which was always the danger if you weren't too careful. But certainly consider an anchor, especially if you're going fairly long distances, because that just gets you out of jail if you're in trouble, gives you that breathing space. We've not really discussed reefing in our sessions, but reefing is basically where you make your sail area smaller, and there are different ways of doing that. So on a topper and a pico, which are single-hander boats, you can wind the sail around the mast, and that makes it smaller. For John in his laser, he can't do that because he's got plastic battens that help create the shape of the sail. So what he would do is have to make a decision before he went sailing as to what rig he'd put on, whether he'd go full rig, radial rig, or is it 4.7, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is the baby rig. So he would have to make a decision in advance, which is fine if he knows it's going to be blowing a force 5 and he'll be in the 4.7 rig. But if it starts off blowing a gale and he's out in the 4.7 and then it drops to 2 knots, he would need the full rig. So he doesn't have the same flexibility that other people do in their boats. So if you're in something like the Miracle, which Eve owns, there is no ability to reef the mainsail. So because this sail hasn't been designed to be shortened and made smaller. So Eve would have an option, which is to either take a knackered old Miracle sail and have it cut down in size and use that, or she would just have to find herself a very fat, heavy crew and then kick him out when the wind gets light, because she wouldn't really have any other option. I'm really lucky in my boat. I have my front sail, the jib, I can furl away or I can pull out halfway or full out. The mainsail I can roll up and tie off, so I can reef on the water or I can reef on land and make the sail area smaller. If your boat has the ability to reef, always make sure that you have those lines ready, because if you're out on the water, it's easier to put the reef in knowing it's already prepared. Now, when you do your level 1 and your level 2, especially your level 2, you'll be shown how to reef the boats that we've got. And there are lots of different ways that the boats are reefed. Some are really simple and lazy, using a zip. Others are called slab reefing. You just pull on some lines and the sail comes down and it's all beautifully concertinaed along the top of the boom. Others, like the bosun, you actually have to roll it around the boom. So there are lots of different methods. But if you in a boat that you can reef, make sure that you've got all that equipment in place so that if you have to reef, it's done really easily. Yeah. What else do you think you might want to take with you? So we've checked the boat, we've checked the reefing, the anchors, and you're going on a trip. What do you think you might want to take with you?
Radio?
Sustenance.
But before we get to food, when you go driving in your car on a long distance, what do you tend to have with you to help you get from A to B?
A map.
Yep, excellent. So in this case, we'd have a chart. So what you can do is, if you sail frequently on certain bits of the Thames, you could copy a chart, laminate it, so that you then have it on the boat, and that will help give you, it'll help orientate you. If you're a little bit unfamiliar, it'll give you the depths of water. It will give you navigation marks and points of conspicuous, what's the word I'm for? Like church towers.
Where the cardinals are.
Yeah, so the cardinals and where church towers are, and navigational stuff. Unfortunately, the power station just above the bridge has disappeared because that was quite useful with the big chimney. So it's always worth taking a relevant chart with you, even in a dinghy. So on our safety boats, we have laminated charts for the Thames area that we normally operate in. It's just for safety, and it's very useful. It also means if you're in trouble and you have to call for help, you can be a lot more specific about where you are, rather than go, oh, I don't know, I'm somewhere around Deereth Yacht Club, but I'm not really sure. So
Because the channel markers have names, you can give names to the channel marker and they can position you.
that's right. So the big red channel marker up above Erith Yacht Club on your way to Dagenham is called Jenning Tree. And then the one opposite Greenhive is called Stone Ness. So they all have names or numbers. In the Medway, they're given numbers. I think it's even numbers for starboard and odd numbers for port. So that way you could, if you're tied up to one of them, you could tell the RNLI exactly where you are and come and find you. The other thing to take with you is navigational equipment. You can get handheld compasses. You might never use one, but to have one, especially if the visibility drops, and you know where you are on the chart, you can start doing some very basic compass work that will help get you back to safety. Compasses are quite useful if you were out on the river and let's say you could see a church tower, but you couldn't remember where you were. You could at least say, well, actually, I'm bearing 40 degrees off the church tower, and they will then be able to pinpoint you. So having a compass is really useful. It just adds that extra level of protection. So yes, food. Don't forget to take food with you. If you've got Eve on your yacht or your dinghy, she will bring food and she will feed you because she is an excellent feeder. I have had many trips where I've been well fed, courtesy of Eve. So always make sure that you take food, even if it's things like, sort of nutty muesli bars and chocolate and water and and stuff like that. So leave the alcohol for when you've picked up a mooring. There are bylaws about being drunk and in charge of sailing boats as well as motorboats. So it's best to stick to the drinking when you've picked up mooring or got ashore. But food is really important, especially if you end up having to row back and you become tired. You need to get your energy levels up. So having food and sensible food. Normally I take stuff that's already sealed in packets like Kipling's cakes or muesli bars or something like that. Or
So
you can
sorry.
No, go on, Eve.
I was just saying, one of the good things to have, everybody, is to have a dry bag. If you can purchase a dry bag to put your bits and bobs in, your phone, and you have your radio on you because they're usually waterproof, but a dry bag I'd say is a must. Yeah,
I got one for Christmas for the first time ever. I've managed to somehow get away with not using a dry bag, but then last year I got everything wet as I capsized and it all floated out the boat. So
as a canoeist, I always used to have dry bags.
So all a dry bag is it's a really useful piece of kit. It's they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and they're usually cylindrical. You can pack all your stuff in, and what you then do is you let some of the air out and you roll it up and clip it, and it'll stay buoyant, but it'll also keep everything dry. It's a really simple but effective piece of kit.
Clip it onto something on the boat.
Yes, so I tended to, where I have had to clip stuff on, I tended to clip it onto the kicker because it was easier for the crew to get hold of in a hurry. But there are other options like on the tow straps at the back of the boat, the other place that I tended to put things. You could also, if you've got the space, use sort of Tupperware boxes because they're relatively watertight, not completely, but they are, in short immersion periods. So if you do make sandwiches, that's what I would suggest putting in something like that. And then they don't get crushed and manky. They're only put in a polythene bag. So on another session, we discussed communication. Can anyone remember anything about the communication that we discussed. So the first thing, I'll pose you a question then. What would you take with you as your means of communication?
Radio. On mobile phone, radio.
Yeah, I'd take a radio.
Okay, so radio and mobile phones. Yes, so Dave, who's in the bottom left-hand corner of my screen, is that a waterproof one, Dave? Yeah, so Dave's got a waterproof radio. In fact, it looks identical to the one I have. So I like ICOM. I find that ICOM radios are the best. I've had Intel, and I've always had problems with Intel radios. You drop them in the mud and they stop working. You drop an Intel, an ICOM on concrete, and it carries on. It just has a scratch. So you can get waterproof radios and ones that are not waterproof. But also always check that they're waterproof. You can get floating radios as well. They're quite expensive, but as it's a piece of kit to do with life saving, it's always worth spending the correct amount of money for these sorts of things. So having a radio, the only downside of a radio is you do need a radio license. I think Ed is our qualified instructor for VHF radio licenses. So I did mine pre-digital days and I've never updated it, but it's a one-day course. It teaches you the correct radio etiquette. It teaches you the phonetic alphabet so that you can spell words out in random words. It will tell you about the channels that you can and cannot use. It's a really useful course. The other downside is that you then have to cough up £80 for the certificate because that goes to the RYA. So it's not a cheap course, but it is a useful course to do, especially if you end up driving safety boats and operate the radios, to have that qualification and to have the know-how of the correct usage. So if I hear anyone using over and out at the end of the conversation, you will be buying me a drink in the bar as punishment, because they are two contradictory terms, and don't believe Hollywood, where it's perpetuated. So over and out is a no-no. The other thing, your mobile phone, yes, please make sure you've charged it up before you've gone on the water. The other thing you can do is buy a battery pack. So when I've been on a classic yacht where they don't have any electricity on board, I've had to take a battery pack with me for my mobile phone. And I can get, I think it's 3.5 charges out of it before it dies. So yes, make sure that you have your phone that's charged, but also make sure that it's put into something waterproof, so that it doesn't get wet and damaged.
Hey, can I say on the subject
Yeah.
of mobile phones, like there's a good piece of advice that says have the phone on your person rather than in the boat, because if you're in a dinghy and you fall out and you're on your own, at least then you can call someone. And also you get these phone-sized dry bags, which are usually given away free at some dinghy races. So I find that really useful for putting my phone in, and you can clip it to your buoyancy aid. But a radio is better, I suppose.
Yeah, I always take a radio with me, and I just make sure that I've got I tend to have the radio searching. So on the River Thames, there are 2 commercial channels. There's channel 14, which is from the point at the bottom of our moorings, Crayford Ness, up into London. And then from that point at Crayford Ness east, it's channel 68. So when ships come up the river into London, they'll call up at Crayford Ness to say to London VTS, who manage the river, we're at Crayford Ness going channel 14. Yeah. So I tend to have my radio on channel 14, channel 68, and our chat channel. So we use an unregulated channel called 37 or M1, I think it is. So some radios don't have 37A. They have M1, which does exactly the same. It's the same channel. So what that means is when I'm out sailing, I can hear what shipping is going on, and VTS, who manage the radio and the river, will call up with forecasts and traffic movements. It also means if you're in trouble, you can call up very quickly because you're only scanning 3 channels you can call up London VTS very quickly if you were in danger and needed assistance. So if you wanted to call the RNLI and they were the quickest thing, you just call up London VTS and go, I need assistance and I'm at Gravesend, you know, hanging onto a mooring buoy on the wrong side of the river or whatever, and they would then send someone out to help. So it's worth making sure that you have the radio on the correct channels. If you have only a phone, you have to call 999 and ask for the Coast Guard. Yeah, it sounds a bit weird being in land, as it were, but call the Coast Guard and they will then coordinate with the RNLI to then come and deal with anything. Do not call the yacht club. I cannot emphasize this enough. We have members who would rather be rescued by Erith Yacht Club because of their pride, but we are not professionals. And by the time we've got dinghies or safety boats launched and so on to go and help people, the RNLI probably would have been there, and it's about saving lives and saving people. So forget your pride, just be rescued by the professionals. The other thing that we forgot to mention when it came to talking about food and drink is medication. If you are asthmatic, make sure you've got your inhalers. If you're on whatever kind of rattly pills, make sure you have those, because it's very easy to underestimate how long you're going to be on the water and then realize that you're now overdue for whatever your medication might be. So always take medication with you. And if you are sailing with other people who you are unfamiliar with, it's worth telling them what your medication is and whatever your medical regime is, so that if you are, let's say, diabetic, they are aware of the signs for if you're going to become hypoglycemic and need to feed you glucose bars or Coca-Cola or whatever the equivalent would be to bring you back up to a more normal sugar level, and then feed you more substantial food for the longer term effects. So you do talk to each other about your medical needs, so that you are again helping yourself as well as stop so you don't scare your crew and all of a sudden you collapse in the bottom of the boat. Also take money with you. Now that our notes are plastic, it's brilliant as a dinghy sailor. You can capsize as many times as you like and the note doesn't get soggy. So take money with you, because you never know if you need to make a phone call, get a taxi, buy your crew a pint because you've sworn at them too many times on the trip. So yeah, I tend to always carry money in my buoyancy aid. I don't tend to carry coins. It goes very green very quickly if you carry coins exposed to seawater. So notes the way forward. Right, I'm realizing that we're almost at the end of this, but happily I'm nearly at the end of our process. So the things to remember then before you get on the water, you need to be aware of the collision regulations. Do you remember we did rules of the road, port and starboard, power versus sail, you know, big ship versus small ship or small boat, that the big ship not being maneuverable, so you get out of its way. So all of these sorts of things, you need to remember the rules of the road, but ultimately it's everyone's responsibility to prevent a collision. So even if you have right of way, quite clearly the person ahead of you who is going to hit you hasn't seen you or isn't moving, but you just get out of their way, and then you can shout abuse at them as you pass them. Yeah. So always remember what the coal regs are, and also the local bylaws. So different rivers have different bylaws, and it's worth just having a quick look. Or if you are at a club and you've never been there before, just ask someone at the club. And if you think the person's a bit of a bullshitter, go and ask someone else to get a second opinion. You'll always find experts at every sailing club, and some genuinely are and others think they are. So it's worth getting a second opinion, but it's knowing what the local bylaws are means that you'll be less likely to get into trouble. And the other side of it, that is, if you ask the locals about the local conditions. So for Erith, if you asked me or John, we could tell you about the eddy outside the yacht club or upriver or downriver. And what that does is that allows you to get a much better understanding of the local area that you're sailing in. So worth asking people what local knowledge you would need to know as a sailor. I mean, it sounds an awful lot that I've gone through, but a lot of it is just really obvious. You know, you do it every time you go for a drive in your car. You know, you think about what clothes you're going to take, what shoes you're going to use for driving. Have you checked the wheels and the oil and the petrol? And you know, it's no different. You know, it just becomes second nature when sailing. But as I said before, with sailing in company, you know, you work together, check each other's boats before launching, help each other to launch. You know, take a tow rope in case one of you has to tow the other. So I've been towed at Erith. I broke a mast and on a keel, and one of the other keels then had to come and tow us back in because there was no safety boat and we couldn't sail in because the mast had collapsed over the back of the boat. And I think that was the first mast I broke that year. I broke a second mast of a boat that Eve owned in the same year, and then I broke a bosun mast. So I did well that year. There's the trouble when you push equipment to its limit. So you're also always going to be acting as people, as each other's safety cover. So that's why you work together. If, as in the case with John, we went sailing, John didn't have a radio, but he was in his laser. So I lent him my radio because my crew had a radio. It just meant that if we needed to point out to each other there's a ship coming up or coming down, then you could get them out of the way. The other thing to take with you, well, I remember, is a whistle. So if you can buy yourself something ridiculous like an Acme Thunderer whistle, they're very loud and very deafening, and you'll get people's attention. Yeah, so if you remember when we were talking about getting people's attention, the waving, the whistles, the flares. So again, the same club I used to sail at up in North Wales, you had to have flares. So you can buy really small handheld flares in a flat pack. So you could take those. We don't tend to use them on the Thames, but if you're sailing on the south coast or wherever, it would be useful to have. So it's just think about all these different things, and it sounds like overkill, but to be honest, it's about just being sensible and knowing that you'll go from A to B and back again, and you'll be alive.
Just one more thing on safety, like excuse me, a torch or something. If you think you might get caught out in the dark, even though it's a small boat, you have to have one sort of torch on with you.
That's right, and the thing about having a torch on a yacht or a dinghy is that you don't shine the torch out, you shine it up the sail, because the sail then magnifies the brightness and becomes a much bigger target for people. And also what they won't do is think you waving a torch around is a navigation mark, because you're actually lighting up the sail. I don't know whether any of you have read Arthur Ransom with We Didn't Mean to Go to Sea. So this was about the Swallows and Amazons kids on their daddy's yacht on the East Coast, and I think it breaks loose from its mooring and it disappears out. And they sail it across to Holland with the wind, but they didn't. And what they end up doing is taking the plastic plates and shining torches through them. So you've got port and starboard. And Patrick even has a copy of the book, We Didn't Mean to Go to Sea. So, so they use torches behind the plastic plates to create the navigation lights that they needed to prevent collisions when they met shipping as they went across the lower end of the North Sea into Holland. So yeah, it's useful having a torch. So I think I have covered everything that I would think about. I don't necessarily have all of this kit I've mentioned to you, but it's useful as a checklist for people. So feel free to ask questions or chip in other ways before we finish.
Thanks, Jeremy and John. I was just wondering, for the more experienced sailors, how reliable is a mobile phone for location purposes? I don't know if anyone has ever had to use a mobile phone to locate where they are in the river.
I wouldn't recommend it. Version of your sort of mobile phone.
Is that me, or have we lost Jeremy?
I think we lost Jeremy.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought it was just me.
All right. Let me try and answer the question then. Yeah. So if you're trying to call for help, there's no way of, you wouldn't really use your phone to tell anyone where you were, would you? You'd tell them which part of the river you're in. In terms of finding out which part of the river you're in, you'd pretty much know. I would have thought, based on the fact that you might have been there before, or you'd be planning the trip, and you'd see things on either side of the river that you'd use to be able to know where you were. But having said that, I use my phone to track my sailing, and then I upload it to Strava. And there's actually an app you can get called Safe Tracks, maybe RVRYA, which tracks your sailing, and it alerts people if you're not back within a certain time, and it relays your location. It sends people text with your location.
Apologies, I seem to disappear there. I think my my Wi-Fi threw a wobbly. John, you're absolutely right. That you have reminded me, and I forgot to mention it. Always tell someone when you're going sailing.
Oh, yeah.
And always then tell them when you've come ashore so that they don't panic. It's a really obvious thing to do, but people do forget, especially if you're going for sail on your own. But it's worth either letting someone know at the yacht club and say, oh, how long are you here for? I'm just going for sail for an hour. And they'll go, oh, well, if they're leaving after the hour, then that's great, because you'll know that there'll be someone around. But if they're leaving before, then it's worth telling a member of the family at home that you'll give them a ring when you get ashore, just so that they know you're back safe and sound. So yeah, it's such an obvious thing, I forgot to mention it.
Thanks.
I did that last week, actually. I mean, I went sailing on my own. I told my wife I was going, but I also went into a shed and I found someone that I got them to agree to, before I think they were going to leave in about an hour, but I got them to agree to like drive over to somewhere where I could see them, and then like hoot their car horn before they were leaving.
Yeah.
And then I'd come back.
So yeah, it's about being sensible. You'll get people who are a bit bravado-like, but to be honest, you can ignore people like that. It's about your own personal safety, and if you're with other people, the safety of the other person as well. It doesn't put you off sailing. It just means that it becomes second nature to just have these little before you go on the water. I mean, we're sailing this weekend. So, you know, and we may or may not have a safety boat on the water, depends on who turns up. But again, it's always about coordinating and planning. And also keeping an eye out, because where the shipping is on the river, you always need to make sure your head is outside the boat looking for that kind of thing before you disappear across the river or out into the fairway, and help each other. It is quite clear that someone hasn't seen the ship that's coming down, or you don't think they have. It's far better to shout abuse at that person to make absolutely certain that they've seen the ship, rather than make an assumption that they have and then cause problems later. Yeah, it's so communicating between each other as well as ashore.
Are you sailing Saturday and Sunday, or just Sunday?
Well, I am sailing Saturday because we're launching Gigi in the morning.
All right.
And
well, high tide on Saturday, low tide is 10:54 at Erith, so high water is 5:01. Are you going to be there early, or are you going to go in the afternoon?
No, we're on Saturday. We're planning to sail from about 11. So we'll get so Ed's getting there for 11.
That's low water.
Yeah, so we're going to put Gigi down at 9, just so that we've got time to put her engine on, get the mooring lines on.
Five. Yeah, that's a nice time. 5:11 is high water.
Yeah, so
I'm just looking at it. I've got the tides here.
So yeah, I don't know who's going to be there. My crew's gone back to university, so I might have space on my boat. If anyone wants.
I just might go Sunday.
Yeah, so it's relatively light winds this weekend, which is quite nice for people if they need to blow the cobwebs out and get on the water.
Yeah, I might go down on Sunday.
I'll be down on both days.
Yeah. Okay.
still feeding that unhealthy obsession like I am then, John.
Yeah, of course.